Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to our 2021 kickoff today. We're going to be talking a lot about hybrid events and moving into 2021. If you guys have questions throughout this, we really encourage you to ask them. There's a questions module on your GoToWebinar. You can put any questions in there, and Whitney and Herman are on to answer questions throughout the session today, even if we don't have time to answer them out loud. We'll also do follow-up after if we need. After the session, there's a half-an-hour break, and then we're back on GoToWebinar for another session about the technology that you can use to set up your hybrid events, followed by 2 sessions this afternoon focused on fundraising types of events that you can do in the upcoming months, as well as how you might set up a race, in-person elements of a race in the spring. Bob is going to get us started today, so go ahead, Bob.
Cool. So before we hop into 2021, I just wanted to say thank you to 2 groups of people. First, to all of our customers who have kind of stuck with us through this really hard time. I know, we hear a lot of stories, and I've talked to a number of people directly about how hard this has been for many of our customers. But I feel like one of the great things about our customer base and about the endurance community and nonprofit community is just how nice and caring people are for each other, and it just makes a world of difference to face tough times with really nice customers. So we appreciate that. And then shout out to the whole RunSignup team. It's just amazing how hard our team worked this year and kind of pivoted on a dime in March, and unfortunately, like on Friday the 13th in March, we had to cut all of our salaries by 50% and stuff like that, and not a single person left. Everybody kind of doubled down on working hard, and it's really what has gotten us through this year. And thankfully we've recovered between PPP and virtual and challenges, and just a lot of new customers and especially nonprofits coming on board with our GiveSignup offering, and by offering nonprofits a way to make money with virtual 5Ks and so forth. With that, let's look forward to 2021, and I'm gonna start a first couple of graphics with some stats on COVID and where we stand. So this first one is kind of, well-known type of chart that everybody sees. The red line shows that we're averaging a couple 100,000 cases a day now. The black line says that we're now over 2,000 deaths per day, unfortunately. And this line is obviously going in the wrong direction at this point in time. But it's kind of like in hockey. What we have to think about is, like, where is the puck going to be? So when we plan our 2021 races, we have to think about where's the puck going to be. So next slide, Johanna. So what's the big issue? I feel like, unfortunately, people have become somewhat nonplussed by the death rates. But what states become really, and local communities become really worried about is when their hospitals reach that capacity. And so in this graph, what you're seeing is I've highlighted the New York State line, and you all remember the watching the news and watching the videos of what was happening in New York hospitals in March and April. And what's happening across everybody, you see this gradual trend of all these gray lines kind of moving up and to the right. That's a real fear as they get to kind of that level line there. And that's kind of like the average number of hospital beds, per million people. And it really puts stress on the healthcare system. And I think that that's really the thing that a lot of people and a lot of governments kind of really react to. So next slide. This is a really interesting chart, and if you haven't heard it, it's really the key behind this whole virus. It's the replication factor. And when a replication factor of 1 means if I get it, I'm going to infect one other person, and then that person will infect somebody else. But when you get into that type of a situation, it's not really an escalating or exponential curve. Once it gets above 1, it does become an exponential curve, kind of like those curves we saw on the first slide. If it's green, it actually happens the other way. And so what you see right now today is you've got about 10 states or so that are green, and the rest of the country is kind of in red. So most of the country is going like this in terms of its COVID case count right now, and some of the country is going like this. Next slide. What's somewhat encouraging is that 2 months ago, pretty much everybody was a red state. So it was a little bit quieter then, and you didn't hear as much about, kind of the explosion in hospital capacity and things like that. But the problem was really seeded a couple of months ago. So really what we have to do is figure out ways to get more states green. Next slide, Johanna. So this is a projection chart, and who knows what projection is real and so forth and so on. We'll put out these slides so you can go to these data sources and play around with this data yourself. But kind of what's somewhat encouraging, and this is what I mean by we got to skate to where the puck is going to be. We're going to see continued escalation of the number of cases, and probably following that, probably about 3 to 4 weeks, you'll see the death count kind of spike, and you'll see hospitalization capacity, kind of spike. But once this curve starts to go down, there's kind of this cascading set of factors that make it go down even more. And certainly, the tools that we've had in place to date, and we obviously saw them back in New York State, back in the early days, New York City area, where you had these complete lockdowns and everybody stay at home. That really brings down the rate. There's limited tolerance for that, but you're seeing more of that happening. So more people are wearing masks, more people are being distant. There's different places kind of approach it differently in the country about whether they open restaurants or not, and what capacity limits they have, and what seating distance they have, and things like that. But overall, I think there's more awareness generally. And next slide. And what's really interesting is that in addition to the masks, awareness, lockdowns, the vaccine is coming. And the vaccine is a thing that has the potential to really impact that really severely. Because, if you think about some of these numbers that are coming out, they're saying, maybe 20 million doses in the US and in the US in December, and probably scaling on a monthly basis after that. The estimates for what Moderna can produce next year, Pfizer, AstraZeneca. There's also the fact that in addition to those 3, Operation Warp Speed has funded 3 others that are looking pretty good in the pipeline. And in addition to that, you have other worldwide, virus vaccine that are making progress. There were some positive reports about Sinopharm from China earlier today and so forth. Biden's come out and talked publicly about hitting 100 million doses in 100 days. And he probably makes that prediction based upon a lot of data because he probably doesn't want to fail in his first 100 days. So there's this vaccine is going to come out pretty rapidly. And so what that means is that if you take some of the population and say if I was infected, or say 100 people are infected, and that replication factor is say a 1.1, that means they infect 110 people. If you bring that 110 potential people and you say 10% of them are vaccinated or 20% of them are vaccinated, pretty much all those red states become green states. And what happens is as you vaccinate more and more people, the replication factor actually goes down, and it makes that curve go way down. So if you go back to the last slide, Johanna, a lot of the reason that you're seeing this steep decline is because the vaccine is kind of on the way, and it has kind of this double impact in addition to the other things that everybody is doing. And what's really interesting about this graph is that date of March 21, that's actually March 1st. And the date of April 1st is at the end of the graph right here. But you look at that at where the projection is, and it depends. You can play with this chart and turn on and off some other things. It could potentially be lower than that, but there's two things that come out of this. One is that the numbers are going to be far lower. There's not going to be hospital capacity. The death rate's going to be going down. The virus rate is going to be going down. And so there's going to be more and more interest in opening things up. And so in our estimation, if we look at the April timeframe, you could be looking at kind of an environment where people are actually looking for live races to happen and for live races to be part of bringing communities back together and online because they're naturally healthy and things like that. Next slide, Johanna. And what's interesting about that is if you're skating to that where the puck is going to be, there should be a little bit of a sense of urgency for your organization in 2021. Pretty much every organization I know of, and we're one of them, needs money, right? So there's this term called early mover advantage. So if your race is the first race to lock down the first weekend in June, like the Scott Coffey race, and say the Scott Coffey race announces first in the southern New Jersey area, we'll be able to kind of get our fair share, or potentially even more than our fair share, of people to register. And so what this does, it allows races to potentially kind of grab market share, to be honest. And there's probably going to be this land grab that happens, especially in the second half of the year, where large, mid-sized, large races, a lot of the spring ones are going to delay to the fall. So there's going to be extra competition coming in the fall. And so if you put together a hybrid plan, which Johanna is going to explain here in a little bit and give a bunch of different examples, then you're putting your organization in place to be flexible in case those graphs don't come down as much as I said and things like that. And then if we look at timers, you have the same type of sense of urgency, early mover advantage. The timers that are proactively helping their customers put together a hybrid plan are going to get more races done and more races out there. And the timers that are not helping their races, some of those races are going to be looking to find people that are proactive, that do want to help them. Next slide, Johanna. So if we look at what's happened, what we've seen in 2020, we actually have seen an increase in live in-person events. In fact, in one of the earlier weekends in November, we actually saw 95 in-person races that had over 100 people a weekend back, the first full weekend in November. So what that says is that people do want to come back. It also says that there are processes and ways to put on safe live events, and that there is kind of this tolerance to put them on, at least in certain parts of the country. And while Thanksgiving saw this kind of shrinking of the number of races that were allowed to go live, we had a number of races that kind of got shut down by their local communities with 5 days to go. The inverse is likely to happen in the springtime. Next slide, Johanna. And the numbers kind of bear this out. That blue line, the blue bar, is showing the number of live race participants, and so it continues to kind of gradually go up as the year has gone on, as a lot of timers have figured out methodologies to put on live events and so forth. Next slide, Johanna. And then, what we're seeing in November is that, transaction volumes are still way down. Donations are up, fortunately, knock on wood. But the turkey trot numbers were just stark. Last year we had 538,000 turkey trot participants. This year there were 156,000 combined live and virtual. So it's impossible to replace that kind of volume, and so it's just really hard. Next slide, Johanna. So I'm going to hand it over to Johanna now to talk about why hybrid and things like that, but hopefully you got kind of context of, I think, where the puck is heading and why it's really important for you to skate there quickly.
Yeah, so, to start out with this, a lot of the reason we wanted to put this together is because when we were talking about, virtual back in March and April, it was a concept that people were familiar with. You may not have put on a virtual race before, but you knew what they were. You had some idea that they were out there. And the idea of a hybrid event, while there are people who technically sort of did them in the past, really is something that's new. And so we really want to get people thinking in that direction so that you're ready to go and hit the ground running as soon as we hit 2021. So the way that we define it is pretty simple. It's essentially just any kind of event, race, run, walk, ride, other type of fundraising event that has both in-person and virtual elements. There's no one size fits all to that. There's a lot of different ways you can put those things together, but you're talking about an event that has two or more of multiple types of events. So there may be part of it that is in person, on a set course, looks very much like a traditional race, except that may have some modifications for safety. You can have parts of it that are on site. There's a defined course. Maybe it's timed, maybe it's not. Maybe there's aid stations. But it has a broader time range. It has an expanded race date. You can do it for a longer period of time. You may have options that allow you to run anywhere that looks more like a traditional virtual race, where you can go out, step out your door, run a 5K, submit your time and count that as your race. Or it may do something virtual that's a little bit more like a challenge rather than having a traditional 5K. It has you, run as many miles as you can over the course of a week. So putting kind of different pieces together is what we really consider a hybrid event. The reason you want to do this, the biggest reason that we can come up with is really just it's your biggest pool of possible participants. There are absolutely traditional runners out there. I can't tell you how many times I have seen on Facebook or heard from someone that a virtual race isn't a real race, and it's not. It's different. And there are people who are willing to do both. There's also people who are only going to show up if it's a real race and they feel like they can sprint towards the finish line and have a really fun race day. So if you're able to put together any sort of in-person feel, you're more likely to appeal to that really traditional participant. At the same time, there's people who might be really happy to show up on a regular race day, have been coming out to your event for years, but they're not really able to do so right now. They're immunocompromised themselves, or they live with someone who's high risk, or they're just generally a little bit more cautious about what types of groups that they're around. And they want to support your event. They want to participate if they can, but they're going to be a lot more likely to sign up for a virtual event. The last group is the expansion participants, and we've heard this from so many races who have had to do something virtual this year, that what they're seeing is a lot of people that they wouldn't normally get. Your virtual participants are not always the same as your in-person participants. You get a lot of people who are from out of state. The number of races who have posted about or sent us information, just really excited about the number of states people have been participating from, is really fun. And what that does is it really opens up who can do your race. You may still have the bulk of your runners be local, but there's a lot of people who want to do something with their family or their friends who may live in another state or may not be able to participate for another reason. And this gives them an option to come in and join. And every option you can give people is just one more possible participant. It also means that people who have a little bit less flexibility right now, they may be dealing with childcare on top of working, they have time to go out and run. And so you're really giving everyone every opportunity to participate. In terms of registrations, runners are never going to register as early as we want, but everything that you can do to build customer confidence is going to help to get you people registered. 2020 cancellations have really made procrastination even worse. When I did just a quick check of numbers the other day, we're up to a full 16% of participants that are registering in the last 3 days. People got burned in early 2020, not necessarily by the fault of the races. They were forced to cancel, quickly. They didn't have good backup plans in place because no one predicted this. But because of that, people are just really, gun shy about spending their money on an event that they aren't sure is going to happen. So if you're able to build a flexible participant management plan and really communicate with people what their options are going to be, it's going to give them the confidence to register. And what I mean by that is anything that you can give them as a backup, either if your event has to cancel or go virtual, or if they need to personally pull out for any reason, if you can give them the options to transfer to another event, to transfer to another race that you're doing, to defer to another year, or to give them a refund, that's going to give them more confidence that they can register. The more flexible you can be, the more confidence you're giving them, the more reason they can register early. But we will caution, just make sure that you're realistic about it. Most races can't afford to do full refunds, particularly now. And if you can't, that's okay. Just be clear about that up front. Make sure that runners know that, but also make sure that you are clear that you're giving them their value in another way if things change. It's also going to prepare you for some of the uncertainty. Like Bob said, we had a number of turkey trots that had done really thorough work, making sure that they were ready for hybrid, in-person like elements to their events for turkey trot season. And numbers started spiking right before Thanksgiving. A large number of them were shut down pretty close to the race date. And most of them did okay. And a lot of that reason is that back in March and April, people were trying to very quickly transfer their entire race to a virtual race. And it's really hard to do, and it doesn't make for the best virtual race. You don't have the option to build out a race that is intentionally virtual. Right now, you have the time and the ability to plan that virtual race really well, make it a really robust virtual option, so that if things do change and you do have to switch more people into the virtual option, it's still going to be a fun race experience for them, and they're going to come out of it more excited about what you're able to do for them. There's a lot of these things that are going to get talked about in the next two sessions, but things like using RaceJoy so that people have an audio experience for their event, making sure that you use participant photo uploads and encourage that, so that one of the fun things can be seeing where everyone did their virtual run, using virtual results, and if doing some sort of a kickoff or a finish live on Instagram or Facebook, they can be a fun way just to connect with people a little bit more. One thing I want to say, we want to be clear about, is that if this sounds like it's more work, it will be more work. When you're planning for two different options, it's more work. That's why we want to get people started thinking about these things now. Because we think to pull these things off really well, it's going to take a little bit of extra work and creativity. That doesn't mean it's impossible. It's not double the work. It just means getting started and really trying to focus on this as early as possible.
It's more productive than watching Netflix.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, this is the time. Like, this is our down season for race season. So if you usually are able to relax a little bit more, and maybe you were able to relax a little bit more earlier this year, now you have some time to really dive in on this stuff. And the last note on that is that a lot of these things, we don't think virtual is going to completely disappear post-pandemic either. Certainly the numbers will skew back towards being largely in person, but there's going to be room for more virtual in the future anyways. And so being prepared for that can help you out long-term, just with, again, reaching those kind of expansion participants. The last note on this is just fundraising. The nonprofits that are out there that are either putting on their own races or that your races are supporting, they can't just wait until July or August or September. Fundraisers have been canceled all across the world, and they're looking for ways to raise any sort of money. The two things that we've definitely seen is people are more likely to participate in a virtual event, even if it's not really their thing, if it's a cause that they believe in and they really want to support what you're doing. And the second is, as Bob said, while our transactions and registrations are down this year, our donations are up. And some of that is just an increased focus on nonprofits, but some of that is that people really are looking for a way to give, and they're happy to support your causes. So put something in front of them that allows them to do that. I'm going to go through this section pretty quickly because it's stuff we've talked about kind of throughout the year, but just to get you guys thinking about some of the things you want to have in mind while you're putting together your plan. everything's got to be based in reality. I highly recommend sitting down with a spreadsheet and going over every number that you used to have and kind of thinking about how those may change moving forward. The first thing, if you haven't done this already, many of you I know have been having these conversations for months, but is make sure that you're talking to all of your stakeholders, governing bodies, your local state officials. We've seen a lot of progress. When we were talking to races back in May, there was a lot of frustration about how uniform local restrictions were, where a lot of races were treated the same as, say, an outdoor concert. And a lot of local race organizers have worked really hard to explain to the people in their orbit how races can be different and can be safer than some other types of events. If no one's done that in your area, you can be the person to lay that groundwork. We know everywhere is different. There are places where it may not be possible to make progress there, but it's really worth starting to talk now and see what kinds of things, are they going to let you put on a 1,000-person race if you can first show them that a 200-person race can be safe? Really, really go through all of the options with your governing bodies.
The other thing to note here, Johanna, is think about utilizing that. You have to plan for the future, right? Because right now they're not going to let you have your 5K, but in April, you show them the graphs that we showed you and show them that this is going to be the future, and you, being a government organization, need to figure out ways to support your community and healthy ways to open back up.
Yeah. Talk to everyone involved. Talk to the places where you host events. See if there's room to change your venue so that you can have more space to spread people out. And the other thing, I don't know if I have on this slide, I know Chris was going to talk about this later today, but is talking to your timer or talking to your races. You guys should have a lot of constant communication about what your options are and what's going to make the most sense. This is a very, very condensed list of what changes you're going to look at in costs. PPE and hand sanitizer are probably things that you didn't have on your list before. We really recommend, and I've gotten this again from a number of races, where you can reduce the number of volunteers. That can help you both in terms of not using up your allotted number of participants on extra volunteers, and also on just cost of outfitting volunteers. So there's places where you can mark your courses a little bit more carefully, reduce the number of turns, have aid stations that are more self-serve. That can also help you with that. In terms of hours, where a race used to take 2 hours, if you have to be out there for 8 hours for a long rolling start, that may just cost more in terms of employee and timing hours. Stuff like porta potties, there's kind of a flip side to this. On the one hand, you may need more porta potties, per person, for some more sanitation. At the same time, you're going to have fewer runners showing up, so that may actually even out. Similarly, individually packaged water and snacks is kind of the way that we're seeing a lot of races go with that. That costs more, but a lot of races are also offering fewer perks like that. There isn't a post-race party, so maybe they don't need as much post-race food or beer, and they can kind of balance their costs that way. Virtual is going to cut some costs, so whatever you do virtually, you're not going to have to pay for permits or the police road closures there, but you are going to have to pay for shipping. So you want to make sure that you've priced out very carefully how much shipping is going to cost, if you're shipping things to people, and figured out whether that's an add-on price that you're adding or if you're incorporating that into the price of the race. Baseline is just run all of your numbers. You want to figure out how many runners you need to have to meet your costs. We do have some races that I've talked to that are organizations that are able to put on races at a slight loss right now, and they're doing that to keep their runners engaged for the future. But not everyone can do that. So make sure that you really run your numbers really carefully and you understand how many in-person and virtual racers you need. This is the fun part. So these are some of the cool things that we've seen people doing. These are by no means the only ways that you can do stuff. The idea of this is to show you guys how creative people can be and get you guys doing, thinking outside the box about how you're going to put some races together. So the Richmond Marathon is a big one. We've talked about this a lot. They did some really cool things, and the way that they had this set up was sort of a dual in-person virtual event. It was a marathon, half marathon, and 8K that was run on an official course. They were able to move their course from their normal course to a city trail, which ran along a roadway, and that meant that they didn't need to close down any roads. They could have access to it for a long period of time. Because of that, they were able to actually chip time it. They kept the course open for 16 days. And people could run it anytime from 5 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. Crisp, who is kind of our in-house race day ninja, but also owns his own timing company. His timing company was able to help them chip time it. And what's cool about that is that they were able to put out, mats and timing equipment, and then Crisp could essentially go back to South Carolina and time it from there. That allowed people to feel like they had a real official race. They had a bib with a chip on it. It came out with a time, but they weren't all crowded there. Other things that they did that made it feel real, they had bottle refill stations. You did have to bring your own water bottle, but there was some level of aid along the course. There were restrooms along the course, and there were mile markers, which I think is a small thing that can make runners really feel like this is a race and not just a small virtual run. Similarly, the finish line, the pictures are kind of funny because it's obviously a very subdued finish line compared to their normal finish line, but it really is something that can make someone feel like they're actually accomplishing something. And I think particularly for something like a marathon or half marathon, that's really important. At the same time, they wanted to open this up to everyone, so you did not have to run that course. You could run anywhere with RaceJoy and validate your time that way. How did it turn out? They had 5,500 registrants. That they put an emphasis on some cool swag. They had a long sleeve tech t-shirt, medal, buff, finisher blanket, a lot of things to really get people excited about it. One of the things that I thought was really interesting from them afterwards is some of the benefits that they didn't even consider. They got a lot of feedback from runners that people actually really liked how they had the course set up, because it meant that it was right by a road. So their friends and family who couldn't come out and spectate normally were able to kind of drive along the road and meet them at various points, and create a little bit more of an exciting race day feel than I think they expected, because people were able to follow them. And that's something that they can use moving into the future. Even when we have more regular races, the ease of access there was a really nice perk for them. Kiowa Island Marathon, this is an event that ended up using kind of a similar setup. So the actual marathon was canceled this year, and they wanted to do something for people who had registered for the event, who were planning on being on the island for the event, and who had been really supportive of them when they canceled. So what they are offering is a 3-day hybrid event. It's not going to be the same. It's something else that is fun and reward kind of for the people who are loyal to them. They've got a couple of cool elements in it. It's going to be 3 distances, and it's showing off elements of a new course that they put together for 2021. So they get to run things that they haven't run in the past. Like Richmond, it's going to be timed during a set period of time from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. with marked courses and aid stations open. But also kind of like Richmond, there's really the ability to run it anywhere with RaceJoy, even if that timed course isn't open then. And one thing that I think is pretty fun that they're doing with RaceJoy is part of encouraging people and teaching people how to use RaceJoy. The same organization has actually did the Santa Parade via RaceJoy, and that itself is not anything to do with the race. It's just the parade of Santa that went around the neighborhood. They had on RaceJoy, they had Santa tracked on RaceJoy, so that people could, from their homes, watch where Santa was on RaceJoy and only come outside when he was close, to prevent crowding from people trying to watch the parade, which is a completely separate thing. But what it also did is set up those same people to know how to use RaceJoy and to be excited to do the same kind of thing when they come out to run, to watch their family and friends during the Holly Jolly Jog.
I think Santa made clear that he was not an official endorser of RaceJoy, but just so we don't overstate Santa's commitment.
So the next 2 on here are a little bit kind of 2 sides of the coin of similar turkey trots. Both of these are turkey trots that had both in-person and virtual events going on simultaneously. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is the Webster Turkey Trot up in upstate New York. They had around 1,200 participants. The majority of them were virtual. This was an old, long-standing race. It's a 49-year tradition. They wanted to make sure that they had a race, and they were able to do that. One thing that I think kind of highlights what you want to talk about with your local officials, their local restrictions say no more than 20 people in a place at a time. And there are places where they may hold that too. You can't have a race of more than 20 people. But instead, they were able to demonstrate that they could have around 200 people spread out over a period of time that would mean that there was never more than 20 people together at once. And that allowed them to put on, a smaller in-person event, but still an in-person element to the race. I am out of order there. So as I noted, this was about 200 people in person. One thing that they did with that is the people that they had in person, they do a promotion each year when the turkey trot ends where they open up super early for the next year. And people can register with some extra perks then for the event. What that meant was that they already had people registered when when the pandemic hit. So that group of people who'd registered early, who are obviously then loyal, engaged participants, those were the people who had the option to participate in person. And that's a nice way, if you have a limited number, finding a way to reward the people who've been really good to your events. It was an open start over 2 hours. They were very, very clear in their communications about every protocol for people who were on site, and really made sure that they had some fun elements there with text and email results. On the flip side, they still had around 1,000 people who participated virtually. So those are people who registered with the intention of participating virtually, which is again an indication that this race was important to people as a tradition. For the virtual event, they did allow a little bit longer of a time range, which I think is usually going to be important. It's nice to have people all at once, but with virtual, you want to really embrace that flexibility and make sure that people are able to participate a little later. On the other hand, the Cocoa Beach Turkey Trot had kind of an inverse. There was a similar number of total participants, about 1,400 people in all. However, most of theirs were in person. One of the things that really stood out when I looked at their setup was how clearly they communicated their contingency plan. So they were able to, hold their race in person. However, it was really, really noted on their website that what would happen if they had to go virtual is that people would have the option to run virtually or to defer. They also made it clear what would happen if they were able to continue the in-person event, but they were no longer able to have as many people, that they would honor entries in the order they were received. That kind of thing is just, again, incredibly important for making people trust that you have your plan together and that you'll take care of them no matter what. At the end of the day, they had around 1,200 people in person, starting on wave times. They did have a packet pickup with some social distancing elements in there. Virtually, they had two different options for virtual that I thought were interesting. One was a regular, just run whatever you want. They also did do an option for people who wanted to run virtually, meaning wanted to run whenever they wanted, but wanted to run the course. So they had a RaceJoy course set up so that people wanted to feel a little bit closer to the real event, but weren't comfortable showing up race day. There was something built in there for them. The last organization I'm going to talk about is Negative Split, and there's a couple of races on here because they've done, I think, a really good job building out their hybrid race profile over the course of the year. So since July, they've produced 5 events with some element that's in person and times 7 of them in 2 states. They explain their strategy for the race exactly as race. So reducing participant densities, avoiding touch points, again, communicating protocols and guidelines, and evaluating their strategies continually, seeing what worked and improving them over the course of several events. Their logistics for that, they're gonna, get people pre-registered. They can pick either in-person or virtual. For their in-person event, people are actually picking a corral time. They are to wait in their car until it is their start window. So their start window isn't like 8:10. It is a 15-20 minute time range where they can show up anytime in that window. So because of that, they can actually show up, kind of wait and see when the start line is empty, and then start whenever they want. And I think that there's a lot of different ways to do things, but communicating to their runners that it's up to them within their window. They just need to pay attention to make sure that they're not starting when there's the other people out there. The other one that I'd wanted to note on here to actually RaceJoy, like I said earlier, they really want to cut down on their volunteers. So having people use RaceJoy gives them another way to give runner instructions, not in place of marking a course, but as backup for marking a course without requiring people to be out on the course, directing people all the time. And then also the photo backdrop at the finish. So I think the one thing that's really hard for a lot of race directors and runners is that there's no after party. There's no fun celebration after. And so doing something simple like putting a photo backdrop there that makes people feel like there's at least a joyful moment of accomplishment can be really useful. These are out of order. Sorry, 1 second. These got out of order somehow here. There we go. A few of their events, these are 4 of the 5 that I'll touch on really quickly. The first one in July, I think this is a really important point to make. A negative split 100, they were sure they'd be able to sell out 100 spots, and they only sold 60. And what they were able to do with that is turn it into something really important for them. They got pictures from that event, they got video of how that event worked, they got runners who were able to talk on social media about how well the run was done. And what that did is build up that customer trust. And they were able to use that to demonstrate to people for their larger events later that this event could be done safely. And that can go a long way. And that's kind of what you're talking about with, if you can't do your largest event, start somewhere and start demonstrating what you can do. Coeur d'Alene Marathon, 1,200 live participants on the West Coast, which is significant. Around 500 chose to be virtual. And they did a 3-day staggered start with about 30 to 35% no-show rate. I think those no-show rates are just kind of useful for people to see how many people are showing up compared to a normal year. Split half marathon was similar, 800 live, 400 virtual, 25 to 30% no-show rate. Huffin for Stuffin, I'm going to talk about a little bit more, I believe, on the next slide. That one, they had 300 live, about 250 virtual. They did a really cool thing with their t-shirts. Rather than having t-shirts as just a add-on that you're picking when you go through registration, they actually sold their registrations where the event title was the t-shirt. And the t-shirts, if you can see them, they were funny pun type names, type t-shirts. And what that did was give them kind of a perk to sell on that wasn't just show up for a race or whatever. The shirt wasn't a second thought, it was something primary, and that's something that they can do right now. One other thing that they did that was really cool, like a lot of races, they didn't have spectators, they didn't allow spectators, but instead of making that kind of a negative don't bring spectators message, they made it a positive. Make sure that you have the whole family running. People can't watch, so make sure everyone's registered to participate and give them a reason to get everyone together and out running. The fun thing that they did on virtual was, like we noted earlier as an option, there wasn't a, go out and run a 5K for Thanksgiving. Instead, they did a challenge version. So people who did the virtual option could run as much as they wanted on Thanksgiving Day and log their miles, and they were able to have on their website a meter showing how many miles everyone together collectively had run on Thanksgiving Day. And that's a fun way to make things a little bit more interesting for someone who is maybe bored of the traditional virtual model. The very last one, Windermere Marathon, is a cool example because it's an event that was originally scheduled for originally scheduled for May and then postponed to September. Because of that, that means they are actually going into their second hybrid version of Windermere. The September version came out pretty well with an 850 or so in person and 450 virtual. They were able to get a lot of news coverage out of it, which I think is, again, going to be a helpful proof point when you're trying to show people that you can do things well and that they can trust your event. So, May is now open. They're starting to get registrations. And if you look at their website, they use the September race constantly as a proof of concept and to demonstrate that they are an authority on this and they know how to do it. You can't, read these really well, but it is, their entire website has examples of what's been done. One of the things that I'm going to include when we send out follow-up information here is that they actually have a YouTube channel that has some of their setups from their starts and their finishes, so that both their runners but also other race directors can see what has worked and can try to replicate that. Really quickly, just some notes for people who are looking at doing these. The things that they maybe hadn't thought about that they've learned. Keeping a course open for several days has some issues. Usually you have to pay attention to equipment not getting stolen, make sure that your markers don't get moved. They did note that they had some increased costs, but also that some of those were offset. So again, going back to your budgeting point there. And like I said, with their first race that didn't fill up as fast as they thought, it's not immediate that you're able to build runner confidence. It takes a little bit of time. Paying attention to courses so you can limit volunteers is important. They used a lot of Race Joy to try to help with that, and corrals to make sure they had spacing, communication, if I haven't said this 19 times already, but communication with the authorities, with their runners, and also internally to make sure that everyone was on the same page, and focusing on things like swag and other types of perks that you can use to kind of replace some of what's fun with after parties. And that's it.
What's happening next, Johanna?
So we have Matt Sinclair and Sean Callahan's presentation on technology and what types of settings you want to use to try to keep your events, your separate events, running optimally.
And that's 2:15 Eastern,
2:15.
right?
Correct.
Okay.
All right, so I think we will adjourn until then. Thank you, guys.
Great. Thanks, everybody.